7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
Are now being deciphered 2,000 years later, thanks in part to artificial intelligence.
Deep beneath layers of volcanic ash in a long-forgotten Roman villa, archaeologists uncovered a bundle of scrolls fused into brittle charcoal.
And that is a phenomenon that we see that affects the Dead Sea Scrolls no less than any other kind of archaeological artifact.
For decades, they were considered unreadable, too fragile to unroll, too damaged to decipher without destroying them. Then, advanced imaging and AI reconstruction began peeling back the carbonized layers, letter by letter.
This is the lab where experts examine fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered 70 years ago.
And when the words finally emerged from the darkness, they revealed ideas that challenged everything historians thought they knew. The burned Ark scroll nobody could read. In the early 1970s, a team of Israeli archaeologists were working at En-Gedi, a small oasis village on the western side of the Dead Sea. En-Gedi had fresh springs, palm trees, terrace fields, and a long Jewish history. Ancient writers like Josephus and Pliny the Elder described it as a place with rich date palms and valuable balsam plants that were used for perfume and medicine. Over many centuries, this little oasis had been a real town with houses, workshops, and later a large synagogue at its center. By the time the modern diggers arrived, the synagogue was a ruin. The stone walls still traced the outline of the prayer hall, and the floor preserved parts of a colorful mosaic carpet with Hebrew and Aramaic words, a list of names, and even a warning not to reveal the secret of the town to outsiders. That inscription probably referred to the recipe for the precious balsam oil that made the village rich. For the people who once lived there, this synagogue was the heart of the community, where they gathered to pray, to hear the Torah read, and to keep their identity alive under changing rulers. The synagogue itself had been discovered a few years earlier by chance when members of the modern kibbutz at En-Gedi were laying a water pipe and hit ancient walls. Proper excavations followed in the 1970s, and archaeologists found that the synagogue building went through several phases. It began as a simpler hall and was later rebuilt as a more impressive basilica-style structure, with a raised platform for reading, decorative mosaics, and a special niche or cabinet on the western side. That niche was the Ark, the holiest spot in the building where Torah scrolls were kept. On a day in May of 1970, the team opened that Ark. Behind the stone and plaster, they expected the remains of scrolls, but what they actually saw looked more like pieces of burned wood. Inside the Ark and on the floor nearby were several lumps of material completely black, crushed, and shiny from burning. These were not clean rolls of leather. They looked like charcoal, and every time someone tried to lift one, tiny flakes broke off and fell away. Even so, the team quickly realized these were not random bits of wood. The shape, the position in the Ark, and the fact that they were layered like tight rolls all pointed to one thing. These were Torah scrolls, handwritten copies of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible that had once been read out loud to the people of En-Gedi. The synagogue dated from the later Roman and Byzantine periods. The synagogue itself seems to have been built around the 3rd century of the Common Era, and it remained in use until the village was destroyed by fire in the 6th or early 7th century. The burned beams, the collapsed roof, and the layer of ash across the floor all tell the same story: a sudden, violent end. Archaeologists disagree on who set that fire. Some think it was part of a campaign by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian against Jewish communities, while others suggest it was a Bedouin raid before the later Persian invasion. In either case, when the flames reached the Ark, the parchment and ink baked, collapsed, and fused into a brittle mass. Beside the charred scrolls were additional items from the same ark: oil lamps, silver charms, coins, glass pieces, and even bones from kosher animals, likely brought from shared community meals there. Together, everything clearly proved this was an active synagogue with regular prayers and rituals, not a museum exhibit space. At that moment, the archaeologists confronted a very simple and painful decision. The methods of preserving ancient objects were not as developed as today is. If they attempted to open the scroll by hand, they would almost certainly ruin it forever. If they left it untouched, it would remain whole, but nobody would ever know what lay inside there now. The archaeologists and museum team decided to preserve the object instead of risking it for words. They gently lifted the biggest charred mass from the ark, supporting it so it would not crumble under its own weight, and transported it to the Israel Antiquities Authority for safekeeping. There it was recorded as a scroll from En-Gedi and stored in a climate-controlled chamber, still sealed inside its charcoal casing. To see why that choice mattered so deeply, it helps to step back briefly to the broader Dead Sea area region now. Roughly 20 meters to the north, in desert cliffs near a place named Qumran, Bedouin shepherds discovered clay jars filled with ancient writings during the late 1940s period back then. That finding sparked 10 years of excavation that uncovered scrolls inside 11 caves there. These manuscripts, now called the Dead Sea Scrolls, contain the earliest copies of many biblical books ever discovered, written between roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. When researchers examined those cave scrolls, they noticed something very important there. The biblical writings did not all appear the same. Some versions matched the wording that later became standard in Jewish scriptures. Others matched more closely with the Greek translation used by early Christians, while still others resembled the version preserved by the Samaritan community there as well. In simple words, the scrolls revealed that during the Second Temple period, several active versions of the same books existed at the same time, then and there. This concept is often known as textual plurality, but it simply means the wording of Scripture was not completely fixed everywhere at that time. That explains why a burned Torah scroll in a later village synagogue near the same sea mattered so much, even if nobody could read it back then there. After the excavation, excitement gradually faded away. The En-Gedi scroll remained in storage in Jerusalem, inside a box, inside a vault. Conservators inspected it occasionally to ensure it stayed stable, but nobody attempted to read it at any time there now. For over 4 decades, the question, "What did it say?" remained simple then. No one knew, and nobody had any safe method to discover it. That silence finally started to shift in the early 21st century, when imaging experts and computer scientists began asking a simple yet bold question. Rather than cutting delicate scrolls open with blades and fingers, could they somehow see inside from outside without damage? How a charcoal lump became a scroll again. Hospitals use scanning machines to see inside the human body, and conservators began wondering if the same approach could work on a burned scroll. To try this idea, they used a device known as a micro-CT scanner. A regular CT scan is the kind of X-ray machine doctors use to look inside a chest or a head. It takes many thin X-ray images through the body from different directions, and a computer stacks those thin images together into a 3-dimensional model. A micro-CT scanner works in the same way, but it is designed for small, solid objects instead of people. It can detect extremely tiny changes inside a piece of material. The team placed the En-Gedi scroll inside this scanner. The machine sent a powerful X-ray beam through the scroll as it slowly rotated. Each time the scroll turned slightly, the scanner captured another thin slice of its interior. When the scan was complete, the computer contained a 3-dimensional block of data showing the entire inside of the scroll. The curators still did not know if any ink would be visible. At first, all they saw was a cloud of gray shades representing different material densities inside the charred mass. When they looked more carefully at the scan and adjusted the contrast, something intriguing appeared. Within the gray form of the parchment were brighter streaks that stood out from everything else. The parchment absorbed some of the X-rays. Empty air absorbed even less, but the ink, which included heavier elements like metals, absorbed far more. That difference showed up as thicker, brighter lines in the scan. For the first time, the team could see that the scroll still contained ink marks inside. That meant letters were still present. There truly was hidden writing, trapped within the burned roll. At this stage, the task shifted from conservators to computer scientists. The digital scan, a massive three-dimensional file, was sent to William Brent Seals and his team at the University of Kentucky. He had spent years developing methods to recover writing from damaged manuscripts using computers. His aim with the En-Gedi scroll was easy to describe, but extremely difficult to achieve. He wanted to accomplish inside the computer what no one could safely attempt in real life. He intended to locate each layer of the scroll, treat those layers like pages, flatten them, and then reveal any ink strokes on those pages in their correct order. The first challenge his team needed to solve was understanding the shape of the scroll within the scan. To the human eye, the scan looked like a tangled collection of curved and folded surfaces, all compressed together and distorted by fire. The computer had to determine where one layer ended and the next began. The team developed software that could trace the path of a thin sheet through the three-dimensional block, similar to outlining each layer of an onion. In their research papers, they refer to this step as segmentation. In simple terms, it means the computer learns to follow one sheet of parchment at a time as it twists and bends inside the lump. This process was not simple. The intense heat from the synagogue fire had warped the scroll. In some areas, layers were fused together. In others, there were bubbles, gaps, or folds. The software had to manage double layers, small cracks, and spots where it was unclear whether the material was parchment or something else entirely. The team needed to refine their approach so the virtual surface they traced stayed aligned with the real parchment and did not jump across layers. This precise tracing of the layers was the slow, careful part of the project, and it formed the base for everything that followed. Once the software created a precise map of one layer, the next step was adding the correct information onto that virtual surface. Remember that the scan stored details about density at every point. Some areas showed parchment, some showed air, and some showed ink. The team developed code that took the darker, denser areas matching ink and applied that pattern onto the virtual parchment layer they traced. This stage is known as texturing, but the idea remains simple. The computer converts the raw scan into a simulated but accurate image of how that layer of the scroll would appear if you could remove it and stretch it before your eyes. Of course, in reality, the parchment layer remains curved. It coils around itself several times. You cannot view all of it at once unless you flatten it. So, the team included one last step. They took every traced and textured layer and mathematically flattened it, like smoothing a wrinkled sheet of paper until it becomes flat. Then, they connected those flattened sections together along their edges. When this finished, the computer displayed one flat image representing a full turn or wrap of the scroll. With the En-Gedi scroll, the method worked so effectively that they recovered clear writing from 5 full wraps of the animal's skin. The final flattened image revealed 2 parallel columns of text. Altogether, there were 35 lines of Hebrew writing. Each line contained roughly 33 or 34 letters. The letters themselves were extremely small. less than 1/10 of an inch tall, yet they appeared as sharp, distinct shapes on the computer display. Some lines remained whole, while others were broken where the parchment had split, but enough remained for the words to be understood. To achieve this, the team used artificial intelligence systems to recognize patterns in the writing. The software learns to distinguish between random scan noise and the exact shapes belonging to genuine ink strokes. That intelligent pattern detection made faint writing traces become much more visible, especially in places where the ink signal was weak or damaged by burning. The most meaningful moment arrived when all these steps finally connected together. After many years of the scroll being considered lifeless, the researchers finally saw a flat image of one scroll wrap on their monitors. Instead of a dark, useless lump, they saw clean, horizontal rows of letters. Once they obtained that complete image, the computer scientists delivered the high-resolution pictures back to the scholars responsible for the scroll archive. Those scholars could finally do what they were trained to do best. They could examine the image letter by letter and line by line, carefully uncovering what the text truly revealed. And it stunned them, because when experts compared those letters with the Bibles used in synagogues today, they discovered the words on this once silent scroll were not what many had expected to find. The words hidden inside the scroll. When the blackened lump finally released its letters, the first clear words were not a mysterious hymn or a forgotten prayer or some bold new prophecy. They were instructions, very old, very firm instructions about how to bring animals and grain to the altar. The burned scroll from the shattered ark turned out to be the opening of the book of Leviticus, the third book of the Torah, written in ancient Hebrew. Leviticus is the book that many people avoid. It begins with rules for burnt offerings and grain offerings, with careful step-by-step lines about how someone brings a bull, a sheep, or a bird, how the priest manages the blood, and how flour and oil are placed on the altar. The En-Gedi scroll preserves parts of those early rules. The readable lines include the start of chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. There are no chapter numbers, no verse numbers, no punctuation marks, and no vowel signs. The words flow as one long chain of consonant letters, the way Torah scrolls appeared in late ancient times. Those missing vowel marks are a subtle hint of age. The tiny dots and strokes that show how to pronounce the vowels in Hebrew were added in writing much later, around the early Middle Ages. Before that, readers learned the proper sounds by memory and tradition. So, a scroll that contains only consonants and no vowel marks is almost certainly older than the 9th century AD, even before anyone examines it with scientific dating. When scientists did test it, they treated a small piece of the charred material and measured how much of a type of carbon remained in it. This method is called radiocarbon dating. The test at the Weizmann Institute in Israel suggested a date somewhere between the 3rd and the 4th century AD. Handwriting specialists then studied the shapes of the letters. They compared them with Hebrew scripts from various centuries. One leading expert, Ada Yardini, argued that the letter forms appeared even earlier, more like the second half of the 1st century AD or the beginning of the 2nd. Another scholar, Drew Longacre, disagreed and said that once you consider gaps in the sample of later handwriting, the letter shapes can still match the radiocarbon date in the 3rd or 4th century. So there is a range, not a single year, but everyone agrees on the broader picture. This scroll was copied many centuries before the classic medieval Torah manuscripts that most printed Hebrew Bibles rely on, and only a few centuries after the last of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were written. It rests in a period where almost no complete Torah scrolls had survived at all. Before this burned scroll revealed its words, many scholars had a simple working idea of that gap. The Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran had already shown that in the final centuries before the Temple in Jerusalem fell, There were several slightly different forms of the Hebrew Bible in use. Some copies matched closely with what later became the standard Jewish text. Others leaned more toward the ancient Greek translation known as the Septuagint, or toward the Samaritan version used by the Samaritan community. Some even blended traits from more than one group. Because of that, many scholars expected that a Leviticus scroll from the first few centuries AD would not match a modern Hebrew Bible word for word. They anticipated at least a few small surprises in the wording. Perhaps some lines would be shorter, or one or two phrases would appear in a different order, or we might see a blend of features from different text traditions. The discovery fit neatly into that expectation. What it actually revealed was almost the exact opposite. Once the letters appeared clearly on the screen, the team passed the text to specialists in the Hebrew Bible. Emmanuel Tov and his colleagues placed the new scroll's lines beside the standard medieval Hebrew text of Leviticus, the version known as the Masoretic text. Masoretic is simply the name for the main traditional Hebrew Bible text used in most Jewish communities for many centuries. What they discovered amazed even those who already believed the text was remarkably stable. Line after line matched exactly. In fact, for the portion that survived, the En-Gedi scroll is identical to the medieval Masoretic text in its letters and in its paragraph breaks. Not just similar, not nearly the same, but identical. A later report observed that this charred scroll even copies the same spots where the text leaves a small space to mark a new section, just like the much later Codex Leningradensis, which is one of the key medieval Masoretic manuscripts. For this section of Leviticus, the words appear to have been fixed in place much earlier than many scholars had assumed. When that burned scroll from En-Gedi finally revealed its voice, it did more than astonish a handful of scholars. Its success sparked a larger question. If a lump of charcoal discovered in a synagogue ark could uncover this much, what else might still be hidden inside the blackened scrolls and fragments kept in vaults and storage rooms around the world? The next scrolls returning to life. The same blend of high-powered X-rays and AI is now being used on another famous graveyard of books, the buried library at Herculaneum in Italy. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, it buried a seaside town and a grand villa under scorching mud and ash. Inside that villa, later called the Villa of the Papyri, hundreds of book scrolls were baked until they became hard and black. 18th century workers uncovered some of them and tried to open them by hand. Many simply crumbled into flakes and dust. Others were cut apart, losing lines of text forever. For more than 2 centuries, most of that library seemed like a heap of worthless charcoal. In recent decades, that has begun to change. Researchers scanned several of the Herculaneum scrolls with specialized X-ray machines that can detect tiny density differences inside solid objects. They then used virtual unwrapping, the same basic idea that saved the En-Gedi scroll, to create flat images of hidden pages. At first, even those images showed almost nothing because the ink on the papyrus did not always stand out in the scans. So, the team at the University of Kentucky released the raw 3-dimensional scan data to the public and, together with tech investors, launched something called the Vesuvius Challenge. It was a straightforward offer to coders and students worldwide. If you can train AI to detect ink and letters inside these black cylinders better than anyone else, there is prize money waiting for you. By early 2024, 3 young competitors had done exactly that. They trained their code to search for tiny texture changes in the scan that matched dried ink. The program then connected those marks into Greek letters and words. Their work extracted more than 2,000 readable characters from one sealed scroll, enough to earn them a grand prize of $700,000 from the Vesuvius Challenge. The text they uncovered was not a random list or a legendary tale. It was a philosophical discussion about pleasure, most likely by the Epicurean writer Philodemus, reflecting on topics like music, simple meals, and whether rare luxuries are truly better than ordinary ones. The same tools are already being pushed even further. Another charred Herculaneum scroll in Oxford, known as P. Herc 172, has now been virtually unrolled as well. In that case, advanced X-ray scans and AI-identified Greek columns that include the word for disgust written more than once, helping scholars connect the text to a work on moral weaknesses, again associated with Philodemus. Thanks for watching. Now, take a look at the videos appearing on screen for more incredible stories.